Welcome, Dr. David Bradshaw, our leader tonight, our moderator, for our discussion on the book by Kyle Harper called From Shame to Sin.
Well, thank you, Father. And I'll try to speak loudly just because we are being recorded. And when y'all speak, I'd encourage you also to speak clearly and loudly if you can. This is not a lecture, and I'm not going to go on for too long. I just want to hit some of the high points from the beginning that we've read for tonight, the introduction and chapter 1, for the sake of those who either didn't have time to read it or may have read it quickly or read it partway. It's fairly detailed. You know, that takes us up through page 80, and there are a lot of footnotes and a lot of information here. The author, Kyle Harper, he's a classicist, not a theologian, whether he's a Christian, I really have no idea. But it's a very solid and highly respected scholarly treatment of this subject. The title and the subtitle will tell you what the book is about: From Shame to Sin, the Christian Transformation of Sexual Morality in Late Antiquity. And you can see from that title that he has to do two things. He has to describe what sexual morality was like prior to Christianity, or prior to widespread Christian influence, and then how Christianity transformed that existing system. So the chapter 1 that we're on tonight is all about the pagans, and both their moral teaching, but also their practices, and even at a deeper level, in a way, the whole economy and way of life of the Roman world that shaped their sexual practices. He's focusing particularly on the 2nd century A.D., because that's sort of the last time when paganism existed in a pure, unchallenged form prior to widespread Christian influence. But a lot of what he says would have been true even for centuries prior to that as well. So let me just touch on some of the main points, and this is just a springboard for us to discuss and talk about, and I'll be curious to hear your thoughts about it. But here are some of the main things he brings out that were prevalent and characteristic of sexual morality at this period in the pagan world. Probably the most telling one and the most ubiquitous one is prostitution. And he puts a lot of emphasis on that, how it was just everywhere in the ancient world. There were brothels, you could say, on every street corner. Many, perhaps most of the prostitutes were slaves. Slave owners could make a profit from putting their slave girls out as prostitutes. Many others, though, had been abandoned. They practiced child exposure in antiquity. And so so far as we can tell statistically, it seems that more girls were abandoned than boys. And so often these girls would be just snatched up by slave traders or others, pimps, we would call them, who were in the business. And they were raised to be prostitutes. And it was a horrible, grimy business. And as bad as prostitution is today, and I think it's horrible enough in our world, but in the ancient world it was even worse. For one thing, slaves had no legal rights at all. They had no recourse if they were mistreated, either by their owner or others. Also, the economics of it were such that in order to make anything like a decent living or a return, to bring back a profit to their owner, they had to be busy all the time because the going rate was extremely low. And he points that out too, that prostitutes were where the men went who couldn't afford slaves of their own. And so the interlocking network between prostitution and slavery was one of the fundamental features that characterized that whole society. And it was very hard for people to even envision how anything could be different. Slavery had been part of the world forever, and prostitution, we know, is, what do they call it, the oldest profession. So he does mention one author who criticized these practices of prostitution, Dio Chrysostom, who was a Stoic, I'm pleased to say, a philosopher. But even when he criticizes it, he's not doing it primarily on moral grounds, as we would want to do. He doesn't stand up and say this is a heinous crime against these women. What he says is that it's bringing down the moral tone of the empire, and he particularly attacks the rationalization that was often used for prostitution, which is that the Romans had a great abhorrence of adultery. Now, you could say this to their credit. They had a high view of marriage, of the legal, at least sort of sanctity of marriage. So one reason that they accepted prostitution so readily was that they thought that it was necessary as an outlet for male sexual energy in order to prevent men from seducing married women. And that was always a great fear. Dio Chrysostom does attack that. He says, on the contrary, what it does is it teaches them to be seducers and adulterers. And so he thinks that it's bad for the empire, bad for society. And, he may well have been right, but that's not the same as giving a fundamental moral critique. And that kind of moral critique, it's astonishing to realize really didn't exist or didn't enter the world until Christianity. So along with the prostitution, there was a widespread, glamorization, if that's the word, but celebration of eros and erotic love. Art forms that we would call pornographic were visible everywhere. Now, if you've ever seen any of the murals from Pompeii, you may be familiar with this. In fact, if you even travel to Athens today, they still sell these little statues in the airport, such as the ancient Greeks had. So it's been part of Mediterranean culture for a long time. But one thing I hadn't known about that I was interested by were the lamps. And this is archaeological proof that this kind of art really was widespread. I mean, Pompeii, you could say, well, we're mainly excavating villas of the well-to-do and finding these murals all over the place. But lamps were owned by everybody, and the lamps were heavily decorated with erotic scenes. And so there was no sense of sort of, propriety that would say some things are not for children. Children were seeing these scenes just as much as adults. So there was a widespread celebration of erotic passion, erotic love. And as he points out, that was not just, as it would be for us, purely a sensual kind of thing. It was also spiritual, because Eros was a god, traditionally viewed as the son of Venus or Aphrodite. But he was considered to be a powerful god and one whom they revered. So these erotic scenes were also celebrating the power of Eros. And that was also sort of part of the mindset of the underlying ethos of the whole culture, that Eros, being a divine power, cannot be suppressed or denied. It simply has to be channeled. Okay? So, and that was the role of prostitution, the role of slave girls for those who could afford them, and partly why something like Christian practices of monasticism would have been unthinkable for pagans at this time. Everyone got married. Now, not everyone was faithful in marriage. In fact, men normally were not. And he quotes authors, even Plutarch, who was a philosopher and did a lot to try to raise the moral tone of society and of marriage in particular. He advises wives just to accept the fact that their husbands may be unfaithful. And he has a sort of a pragmatic stance. He says, well, look, if they're going to prostitutes, then they're kind of getting that out of their system. And they won't ask you to do things that you'd rather not do.
Where did the idea of chastity of marriage come from for the wives even?
Well, there was a very sharp double standard between men and women. So wives were expected to be chaste. And that went along with different ages of marriage and different practices altogether. So girls would normally marry in their mid-teens, all right, whereas men, it was more often in the late 20s, almost twice the age of the young woman. He doesn't mention it, but there's a chapter in Aristotle's Politics, going back to Aristotle among the ancient Greeks, who figures this out. What is the best age for marriage for both men and women? And it's a very straightforward question in his mind. Over what years are they each biologically fertile? And we want to maximize the overlap in order to maximize the potential offspring. And what he comes up with is that women should marry at about age 17 and men about age 35. Because men, of course, are fertile longer in life. So that's a philosopher doing it rigidly, but it was the widespread practice that the groom would be about twice the age of the bride. And now what went with that, sort of the unspoken accompaniment of that, was that yes, the bride usually was a virgin at the time of marriage, and that was expected, and of course her husband, her father rather, and her brothers helped to keep a close eye on her to make sure that was the case, that family honor was at stake. The groom was expected not to be a virgin, anything but. And in fact, the way that Harper describes it was sort of, so men come of age about age 14, and they were expected then to sort of make the rounds, whether among the slave girls or the prostitutes, in order to learn the ropes. And the people thought nothing of it. That was a normal part of growing up as a young man. What they did worry about, though, was the men in their 20s. Because by the time they're in their 20s, they're sexually experienced, they're not yet married, but they have learned the ropes sufficiently so that they're dangerous to men who have wives. They're potential seducers of young married women. And another flip side of the fact that the husband is typically much older than the wife is that wives often, might see some benefit in a younger man. And so seduction was a real possibility or a real danger in their minds.
Well, and adultery is a term that is about keeping the married woman undefiled or chaste in her marriage. Mm-hmm. And adultery doesn't, it's my understanding, adultery doesn't apply to men.
Right. Well, these terms for virtues, sophrosune is the Greek term, meant something different for men and for women. Sophrosune is in the New Testament, by the way. It's often translated something like temperance, self-control. But for a woman, it meant strictly being chaste, sex only within marriage. For a man, it meant self-control. And it was part of the common ethos that, yes, men could roam freely, but to be excessively given to sensual pleasure was a kind of weakness and could actually make a man effeminate. Tina?
Or I think adultery applies if you're having sex with another free man's wife.
Yes.
You could have sex with your slaves, you can have
Yes.
sex with prostitutes.
Yes.
You better not have sex with
You're
another
right.
Roman citizen's wife. Then you're an adulterer, and then they're likely to do something really harsh to you, right? Because that whole thing in the book about one of the things about prostitution and slavery is to keep you from having sex with Roman citizen women and free boys, not slave boys, free boys, right?
Mm-hmm.
They said that was one of the huge issues.
Yeah, that's a good point. They were very strict about adultery, not exactly on what we would consider at least moral grounds.
Property.
Grounds of property and honor, family honor. Of course, if it's a married woman, the one thing that's at stake there is, does the father or the husband know that the children are his?
Yeah.
And that's crucially important.
Especially for inheritance.
Yeah. The whole purpose of marriage is to produce legitimate legal offspring. Yeah. Now he does, he talks about that as well. Does that mean that the marriages were loveless? Well, no, typically not. The ideal or the expectation was that love would grow out of living together, having sex and raising children. So it was a different, cart before the horse compared to the way we think about things. But still, the expectation was love. And by the way, the love, the Greek term that he mentions there is philia, as opposed to eros. Eros, the god, is love as a passion of overwhelming force, very dangerous, potentially dangerous. Philia is a little bit more subdued and regular and reliable. And so the ideal kind of love in a marriage would be philia between the man and the wife.
Did they have a courting procedure? Were their marriages arranged? Or how did the male and female get together?
Typically arranged.
They were arranged.
And he mentions that they had professional, what did he call them, marriage recruiters, matchmakers, yeah. Who he said they're like real estate agents today, that they would find out what each family was looking for, and do the negotiations, so yeah. And oddly enough, though, this could produce very stable, happy marriages. Go figure. It's still true in a lot of the world, isn't it? That there are arranged marriages. Yeah. Now, Tina had mentioned attraction to young boys, so I might as well throw that in the mix too, just as part of the sort of the scene of pagan antiquity. Pederasty, the love for boys, had also been part of pagan culture, at least since the ancient Greeks. Plato has a lot to say about it. If you look at Greek society, it's rather interesting. The earliest Greek authors, Homer and Hesiod, actually don't mention this. And I've read historians who think that, well, at that time, that would have been 7th and 8th century BC. It was not a widespread practice. But what happened then around the 6th century BC was there were changes, economic changes in society, so that women were more and more secluded within the household and not a part of sort of public life. And what kind of went along with that was that men then seeking companionship in the public world turned more and more to other men. So at least by the classical era, by the time of Plato, it was a practice where older men would often try to seduce adolescent young men. And Plato talks about it in sort of at least a potentially idealized way. It doesn't have to be sexual. In fact, preferably it shouldn't be. It should be more a matter of a sort of an older mentor bringing forth intellectual and spiritual and moral beauty within the beloved. According to Harper, at least, the Romans were not the idealistic types. Okay,
the conquerors of the world.
Yes, he says that they focused on the mechanics of pleasure, but they did. There were still boundaries, and for them, the key boundary, as Tina mentioned, was whether the boy was freeborn or a slave. Slaves were fair game, at least the only limit being what the owner would permit.
And they had age parameters to it,
yes,
before the beard.
Yeah, the ideal age, he says, around 16 to 18. I don't think that they necessarily limited it to that, but that would have been the ideal.
You see that with the Greeks, where you have the older man, and he's allowed to love the younger man that he's sort of shepherding into adulthood, and then sometimes sex is a part of that, and sometimes not, but then there's you get this thing where there's this place where if he's still mooning after him when he's like in his 20s and ready to be married, it's kind of considered unseemly. And I'm sure David will talk about this too, but the other thing you notice when you read the book is the whole Roman, and if you teach philosophy or religion or sex to college students, and you have to explain that in Roman culture there was we're reading this book, not to be indelicate, but the issue with male-on-male sex is who's on top.
Right.
It's not a problem to be the penetrator. It is a problem to be the penetrated. And of course, if you're a slave, then who cares what you think, right? I mean, the book said they're kind of like furniture anyway. Married people would have sex with their slaves in the room, which I had seen dramatizations of that because they look the furniture. Who cares?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, it's striking to me, at least, how little humanity. In a way, it's very human. You can understand why people would do all this, but in the fact that slaves were almost invisible as human beings, people hardly even talk about them. They're just assumed to be always there, always available to be used. What the slave might think or feel is just not even considered. That's to my mind the inhumanity of it. But yeah, you're right. The Romans, of course, believed in vigor, strength, male strength. Y'all may or may not know the word for virtue. Our word virtue comes from virtus in Latin, which comes from the word vir, man.
Virile.
Yeah, like the word virile. And for the Romans, virtue primarily was manliness. And so, the body of a free Roman male was not to be penetrated. If it was, that was a deep shame. So that was the boundary in their mind. And so if then an adult man had an excessive attraction to other males, particularly beyond the age of boys, that would have been also shameful, considered a kind of effeminacy, a weakness. I mean, I have more I could say, but does this all kind of fit together? Do you see how it's a very coherent world?
I was going to say, the thing that caught me was the sense of fate and the sense that there were just these social roles to play and to be a part of. And it really did not come down to, individual personal choice. And that is the thing, the fact that Paul then comes along and says, there is no slave nor free, there is no male nor female, there is no Jew nor Greek. That's the leveling of the field that none of this world accounts for. And there's a fatalistic sense to it that if you're inside of it, you've got to play your role.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And he hasn't gotten into it yet in this chapter, but he does mention in the introduction that part of what Christianity brings into the world is not just a different moral code, but a different metaphysics of free will. And the belief that no, we're not subject to the stars or to fate or to society, that God has given us the gift of free will so that we can stand before Him and be answerable to Him for the lives that we live. And there's a lot of fatalism throughout the Roman view. Both he mentions the Stoic philosophers toward the end of the chapter, but he also mentions a novel called Lycippus and Cleitophon that was one of the ancient romances. And being a novel, being a romance, it's fiction. A lot of it's drama, melodramatic and so on. But part of the story is to sort of illustrate how the heroine, Cleitophon, maintains her virtue, despite living in this brutal world, and she's continually kidnapped and shipwrecked and, taken on board by pirates. And through trickery and connivery and just plain good luck, she maintains her virtue or her chastity all the way till the end when she's married to the hero, Lycippus. But the novel makes it very clear that this is largely a matter of luck or of fate, whatever you prefer to call it. And so, for the Romans, virtue was a lot of virtue was just, are you born in the right position in life?
And what star?
Yeah.
The astrological signs.
Yeah. I mean, if you're born a slave, then you really have no chance of virtue unless your master happens to be one who wants to give you that kind of freedom, but most probably did.
That's fate too.
Yeah, right. You're still dependent upon...
Women in particular have no real ability to have virtue on their own because her virtue is dependent on how the men around her treat her.
Yeah, right. Now he does bring out that the Romans, more than the Greeks, women did have some independent status within society. And this is partly a feature of the way marriages were arranged, that traditionally in Roman law, the wife remained under the potestas, the power, the authority of her father when she initially enters the marriage, rather than her husband. So that her, legally, everything she does has to be sort of under the supervision and guidance of her father. Now, Augustus issued a law that once a woman had borne 3 children, this was an incentive to have children, okay? Once a woman or wife had 3 children, then she achieved legal independence from her father, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting, at no point did she just come under the potestas of her husband, and their property remained separate. So the dowry always remained legally separate from the husband's property. And furthermore, the wife actually had legal right to divorce her husband at will, which was surprising to me. Now, that went both ways, but either spouse could divorce. But all of those kind of contributed to give the wives a certain independence, social independence. And the other thing that he mentions contributed to that was, well, first of all, the husband is older at the point when he marries. Lifespans are not very long. And if it was then as it is now, men had a shorter lifespan than women. So there were many young widows in society. Many women whose husbands died natural death or for whatever cause. And they retained their property, and so they had, then the freedom to sort of negotiate remarriage on their own terms. And this you can see these in the New Testament sometimes, because I think some of the women, now you were seminarian, so you may know more about this than I do, but from what I understand, some of the women that St. Paul refers to, who were hosting church meetings and so on in their homes were often widows who had property.
Well, and then you also have this heroine that comes along, who is the repentant prostitute, and she becomes, through her dedication to God, kind of the epitome, just under the ever virginity. What was making sense in my mind is you have, on the one hand, you have the whole ever virginity of Mary, which makes much more sense. But then you have this whole celebration of prostitutes who receive salvation and then go into this life of chastity that is redeeming. It's redemptive to the point that they gain this kind of virginity.
Yeah.
And so they gain their worth, their freedom, their free will in all of this. The other question that kind of struck me were the accounts like of Sarah and Abraham when they turned to Hagar. And they expect her to bear a child for Abraham. There was a little bit more sense for me in this from understanding this worldview. But then also the shame of being childless and what needed to be overcome and why that is such a strong, kind of type throughout or scope throughout Scripture as we see it. And that kind of comes all the way through up to Mary, up to John the Baptist.
Well, so far as the, redeemed prostitutes, like St. Mary of Egypt.
Yeah, I was going to say, Mary of
prominent.
Egypt is par excellence there.
And there are several of these. St. Pelagia is one.
Mm-hmm.
But it's striking, that would have been unthinkable for the pagans at this time. Because, redemption, there's no such thing as a sort of a spiritual redemption. Redemption can only be within the eyes of society.
Yeah.
And a woman who's a harlot, society offers no redemption. There's no second chance. He mentions, I find this kind of interesting, they had rhetorical exercises for students in school where they would write a speech or something or give a speech on a set topic. So one of the set topics was, tells a story of a woman, a very virtuous woman, who through no fault of her own was kidnapped and sold into a brothel. But through trickery and conniving managed to keep her virginity intact while she was in the brothel and then escaped. And the question the student had to respond to was, is she still chaste? Does she still have the virtue of chastity? And, the answer could be either yes or no. And what Harper points out is that there was a certain ambivalence in the very concept of chastity, because it was thought of as both an inner moral state, but also you're standing before the eyes of others in society. And so she had lost the latter by the mere fact of living in a brothel. She had descended to the very lowest point of society and was sort of irredeemably tainted by that. But she had kept the former. She had kept her inner state. And so it's sort of pointing out a kind of you might say, a little bit of a schizophrenia within the pagan mind, that they just assume by and large that the inner and the outer will go together, where we know that in reality they don't. And Christianity is the first to sort of open up that door to say, well, you can be shameful in the eyes of society, but still seek to please God. And so,
let me ask you a question about what he said about fate, because in the romance, right, with Kippy's, actually, I think the one
Okay,
that about.
sure.
Anyway, so she gets kidnapped, right, and all that sort of thing, but she's a freeborn woman. And in relation to fate, doesn't he say, am I reading him correctly, when the romance sort of suggests that ultimately nothing terrible can really happen to her because she is a freeborn, virtuous woman, right? That if you are freeborn and virtuous, that somehow fate will deliver you from...
Well, that's part of the romance, I think. Yes, yes, that's.
So it's assumed at the beginning of the romance that she's going to come out at the other end virtuous and unstained, and I mean, it sort of reminds me of bad things don't happen to good people.
Yeah,
right. That
yeah.
something bad happens to you, it must be because you're somehow not what you.
I've always likened it to the when I read this, kind of likened it to the Hallmark. And you get a few people that walk in, and they're not at all on the same page. But by the end of the movie, I mean, you might as well just stop watching there and go to the last 7 minutes of the movie when they kiss, and it's the same thing. And I really think that this is played out in the same way, in the sense that because she is free, they ultimately know that she's going to be saved through marriage. And that's the one piece of salvation that he seemed to talk about was that the novelist would have those who were involved in this homoerotic pederasty, that they would die because that love was not pure. But the ones who found marriage to a woman would live, and that they would find salvation that way through the legitimacy of children and the carrying on of everything else. That was the societal salvation that they were looking for.
Well, I think that's why he calls it from shame to sin, because they don't have sin, they have shame.
Yeah.
And you see that in shame cultures now, right? If I misbehave sexually, I disgrace my family. And it's not about sin, it's about how other people see you.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, my hunch would be that these romance novels were often read by married women.
Much like the Hallmark movies.
It may be no coincidence that they sort of elevate marriage to this ideal state, where. So,
I'm looking forward to seeing where he goes with the shame thing, because yes, it does seem that there is no concept of sin, but I think we'd be hard pressed to say, and again, maybe he'll prove me wrong on this, but in the church, there certainly is a sense of, if there's infidelity between a man and a woman, there's never been a sense that that's not inappropriate or something that the community would not celebrate that as a matter of good practice, but were it known, So I'm interested in seeing how he traces all of that, because Christianity doesn't do away with all that necessarily, but it does transform it and maybe shift where the focus is.
I was going to say,
on the personal sin.
It seems to me that the shaming Christianity, because one of the things that I did was I was looking at a podcast, since I didn't get all the reading done, I was trying to, get ahead of the lecture. Old college trip. I went out to Ancient Faith Radio and I just kind of typed in shame, thinking, okay, I'll pull up, somebody's podcast on this book, and I didn't do that. But there are a lot of homilies out there that talk about the shame and the Sunday of the Last Judgment. So where we have to examine our life as we will be before the throne, and the judgment seat.
It's all being revealed.
Yeah, all being revealed, and we have to live in that reality of shame, where the shame that he's talking about, it seems to be, is much more about this fatalistic world of shunning your Romanness, or shunning your Greekness, or shunning your being
self-hate.
Free. Well, it's almost societal on that level. I mean, I don't think that you had personhood, and you would be much better at this, teaching from a philosophical point of view. But it doesn't seem that they have the same level of personhood as you go back and even look at some of the more general, like the Oedipus Rex plays and Antigone and things like this. You just don't have the sense of personhood that we have today, and even individual accountability before God.
Well, I think the idea of the value of the individual person as unique and irreplaceable and precious, right? That's not there.
No.
It's all about the shame is the family honor being something.
Yeah.
Not about the woman, but about the family.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's one of the things that we're going to have to deal with, in the sense of shame being something that's completely cultural.
So I can't help but rush toward modern equivalencies, which is not helpful to me. But I was thinking about the current interest and concern about rape. There's a huge interest now, and on campuses and elsewhere about addressing the problem of rape, and there are a variety of solutions that are proposed. I was wondering, what would the reaction of, let's say, I had a daughter who was 20 years old, and I'm a free man, and my daughter was raped. What would be the? Do you have any idea what the? I didn't see this in the first chapter. What kind of consequences would fall upon my daughter or our family for that to happen? I mean, I just have no. Would the man be blamed? Would my daughter be blamed? Would everyone be blamed? What would that look like?
Well, I think the man will be blamed. He does mention that, unlike some later cultures, there was no sort of tendency to blame the victim in cases of rape. That if a man had been the aggressor, they would hunt him down and find him and punish him. Now, I don't know how reliable the justice system was. That's another question. But sure, they took it very seriously.
Mm-hmm. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that his crime wouldn't have been against the woman. His crime would have been against the father.
Or the husband.
Or the husband.
Yeah.
If it's the crime would be that he violated the father's honor, or the husband's honor, not that he violated the woman at all.
That's true, at least if she was unmarried. Now, I think for married women, at least my sense is that they were understood to sort of have status and virtue of their marriage. But yeah, for the young girls, that would certainly be true.
But after rape, there would be a change in the woman's, and how the woman was viewed by society, right?
I guess so. Yeah. I wish he had talked about that.
It's a big question for us now.
Yeah.
He seems to be very active online.
Oh yeah.
And I wonder whether, if there are questions, whether if you just didn't pose them, whether he would not address them. He's a provost as a part of Oklahoma University system, and quite active online. So.
Okay.
If you have things, we may just gather them together and say, we had a study.
Well, there are different things that you wonder about as you're reading, and that he doesn't get. Another one that came to my mind was just this lives of children.
Yes.
The status of children, because he does point out that there was no sense that children should be sheltered or protected from the sexual realities of the world around them.
Even in families?
Oh, no, in
families?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, like I said, the ark, the lamps were all decorated with these bird scenes. And, so, yeah.
Can I put a question on the table in regard to that? And it's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Just put it there and you can perhaps address it as you go around. There were several issues that you raised at the beginning that you gave as examples of how terrible all of this was. And some of them were kind of civil rights issues. The slaves had no rights. Nobody cared how they felt or thought. They couldn't complain. They couldn't protest. They had no recourse. So that's maybe a civil rights issue about slaves. And then there was the question of, who is the abuser, who is the abused. And then there was the question of their more amoral or neutral attitude toward having everybody think that sex was a natural thing. There was no problem with kids knowing about it because it was a natural thing. Sort of putting us in the same category as our animal cousins, and nothing wrong with it. And these are different aspects of this question, and I'm guessing, though I haven't read the book, that they might be addressed separately, either by him or by us as we go along. So it might be that some things are worse than others in the eye of the church.
Oh, yeah. We haven't gotten to the Christian critique of any of this. And
it's also interesting that he actually wrote a book previous to this. And this is kind of a secondary and a jump-off point. His first book was all about slavery. And then he just used slavery and the kind of sexual ethos as a launching off point to kind of consider this whole other question of life. And he had, at least I guess this was in a podcast maybe, that he admitted that. And he said, this is really kind of a cheap way to write a second book, but I'd done all the work on the slavery. And so all I had to do was kind of fill in the other things.
Yeah, I remember reading years and years ago about some of Margaret Mead's studies about sexual practices in different pagan societies, and how it was regarded as perfectly natural that the adults would teach the children about sex the way we teach them about everything else, and there's nothing wrong with it. But in our Christian society, that's become a taboo. You can teach your kids anything you want, but don't you go there.
Hasn't a lot of Margaret Mead's work been
Debunked. Yeah.
It may have been,
I
but
think
it's
so.
an issue. I mean, I'm
Yeah, no, you're right. It has been debunked, but it hasn't been treated as being debunked. Like everybody still
Right.
thinks that it's like
Uses her
that.
studies.
Yeah, uses her studies and stuff. And
Yeah.
I think they found out that maybe a lot of the pagan societies were a lot more uptight about sex than she thought.
Yeah.
That she seemed to take the now, but I think the Romans.
But I'm not trying to use her studies
Yeah.
as proving that
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is okay in some places. I'm asking the question, why is this
Yeah.
not okay?
Yeah.
Well, it fascinated me, and I kind of slipped into it. You know, growing up, I was raised around a bunch of farmers. And so I had a sense of sex education outside of the home, you know, in the barn. But this is a world where sex is not hidden at that level. Even birth, you know, humans have to be present for this, and the children are brought along because this is part of what's going on. They're seeing all of this in the world, and so in one way, it's the Warren Cup, where on the one side it has a young, you know, has a homoerotic scene between a man and a young slave, and later on the same man and the slave is older, and the little one, there's a little one at the door looking in. And so it's almost as if the child is viewed, one take on this is that the child is viewing his future and viewing the relationship that he's going to be in. But it's just because that's how open the world is. But it's much more based on the agrarianness. One of the things that I thought about was just, you know, how open is this in an agrarian culture? And we tend to not have that. I mean, you know, we tend to not only on the front side of life, from procreation to birth, but now, you know, there are churches deciding that they won't have bodies, that, you know, in churches because it will only have celebrations of life. And we tend to push all of this away that we don't want to deal with in our culture today. And it's really discomforting to me that.
Well, he does point out that just at a physical level, you know, houses were not often big enough to allow a lot of privacy. So that was a fact as well. And that would have been true even in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. So we have expectations about privacy that just wouldn't have been realistic for most of the ancient world.
Even among Christian people.
Yeah. Now but I do think, for what it's worth, I read an interesting article recently about how Christianity discovered childhood. Because the very idea that a childhood is a time of innocence, a time of purity, wasn't part of the pagan mind. But you can find it in the Gospels, where Christ says, "Suffer the little children to come unto me. I tell you that their angels do always behold the face of my Father in heaven. It's better for him that a millstone be tied around his neck and to be thrown in the sea rather than to harm one of these little ones.
Unless you become like a child.
Unless you become like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." So, you know, Christ is elevating children as a kind of a model of what we should be like before our Heavenly Father. And that's a whole way of thinking that the pagans just don't have. They don't have a Heavenly Father, you know. They have Jupiter, who rules the cosmos, but he's not their father. He's not someone that they will stand before and give an account of their lives and seek to be in communion with for all eternity.
You can buy them off, but you don't love them.
Yeah, right. So,
Dr. Day, are we finished?
Yeah.
I want to springboard off of that, going off of what Ellie said, which I really liked. So, you almost could retitle the book, Ellie, "Shame to Sin to Shame." So, if childhood is needed in the Christian sense, then what it leaves is this age of innocence where sexuality and sex ed has been kind of removed, other than maybe in a natural home setting of hearing through the walls or something. But then it provides this time where, well, then there's some time of education then after that, or a transition phase into adulthood where there is some kind of further education and character building into responsible sexuality. Can you comment on that? that movement?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we'll see some things about that in the next few chapters once he talks about how Christians were responding to this pagan world and were trying to build a different world.
Okay.
And a lot of things, some of it's very basic. Christianity didn't have this huge gap between the age of marriage for young men and women. Because in Christianity, men were expected to be chaste before marriage, just as women were. Well, it's mighty hard to be chaste, to remain chaste at the age of 28 or 30. So men tended to get married younger. And that changed a lot. That changed the whole dynamic of marriage. That removed a lot of the inequality in terms of social status and knowledge and sort of, knowing the ropes of the world that had been there before. It created more of a situation where the husband and wife are learning together, you might say. I mean, a lot of things changed that he'll be talking about.
So it's probably worth noting that one of the reasons that baptism was delayed in adults, especially aristocratic adults in the 3rd and 4th century, was because they were part of this culture where you weren't getting married. And how could you hold your baptismal vows as a 35-year-old man who's not married? Because everyone's expecting you're going to be doing what everyone else is doing. And so they would delay baptism until the 30s oftentimes, probably for this very reason.
Yeah.
A man was going to do what he's going to do.
Yeah.
He's not married. He's not channeling his sexual energies that way yet. So,
well, of course, monasticism is also going to work a huge revolution.
Sure.
Because it will show that, yes, it is
there
possible.
is possibility here.
We talked about, Bert mentioned they didn't have a sense of personhood. Of course, that comes from our relationship to God. But how did they, what was their anthropology? How basically did they define themselves? Were they primitive citizens? Primitive sexual beings? How would they define an individual in that culture?
Well, there are different philosophical answers to that that had some influence in the wider society in a sort of diluted way. Plato believed that what you are really is an immortal soul that existed prior to birth and then lives an earthly life and eventually is reborn into another earthly life. And, he believed in a cycle of reincarnation. The Stoics didn't believe that. They didn't believe the soul is immortal, but they did believe the soul is divine, because for them the soul is a little bit of the divine logos that is present within this body. It's an interesting fact about the Stoics. They believed in God, but they were also materialists, because for them God, the divine logos, is a kind of very ethereal matter that permeates things, and the presence of God that's here, right here, is my soul. And that's me, but when I die, it sort of dissipates and rejoins the logos of the world.
That's a very Buddhist idea.
Star Trek.
Epicureans, was that a philosophical?
Yeah,
pleasure was everything.
They were materialists and atomists, so they also didn't believe in immortality. And unlike the Stoics, who did think that our reason is sort of our participation in the divine reason. Okay, but for the Epicureans, no. They were pretty down-to-earth, much more like modern-day atheists, although they did believe in the gods who were sort of out there somewhere between the worlds, but didn't really affect human life. But they were a small minority. The Stoics were much more influential, especially in the Roman period, and the Neoplatonists were influential. But yeah, I think if you ask the average citizen, the average active man, he may or may not have been interested in some of these philosophical ideas, but definitely your political identity would have been, your social standing would have been probably the first thing you think of. If somebody asks you, well, who are you? They'd say, I'm a Roman citizen. I'm the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so.
So it's all kind of horizontal. There's no reference to.
Yeah.
Dr. David, I had a question. The Ptolemy, he was referenced throughout chapter 1. Is this the same Ptolemy who was the astronomer?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And which school was he part of?
I don't know about if he belonged to a philosophical school, but because he was an astronomer and mathematician and astrologer,
right.
And of course those went together in the ancient world. Yeah. But he's the same one who worked out the system of the epicycles and all that.
That's neat. I want to read this paragraph, and there are a couple of comments I heard them making. This is page 34. I find that the references to Ptolemy the most interesting, actually.
Oh, yeah.
that was very fascinating. Ptolemy distinguished between men who kept their behavior private and those who, quote, straightforwardly and openly lacked shame. That men indulged in deviant behavior behind closed doors was the inexhaustible stuff of invective. More interesting is the second type, those who self-identified as non-compliant sexual beings. This sort, Ptolemy said, occupied a role that was like, quote, that of a vulgar prostitute exposed to all shame and abuse, end quote. The assimilation of the public pathic and the prostitute may well reflect both material and legal reality. There was certainly a male brothel scene in Rome, and presumably in most towns of any scale in the empire. More profoundly, willful sexual submission by a male entailed infamia, literally a lack of respectable reputation, which brought impairment of civil rights. In this atmosphere, it has been suggested a subculture flourished. What's interesting to me, for how different their cultural norms are, this is not, their libertinism was only of a certain type. It's just as constrained in a way as ours. It's just as different values, different expectations, but the same kind of fear that you might have in modern, in 20th century, foreign America about sexual deviancy you find here, which is interesting to me. And the second thing is my question, really more of a question is, what might impairment of civil rights look like in ancient Rome? We don't probably voting rights. What could that mean? I really don't have any kind of concept for that.
Yeah. Well, it's too bad he doesn't elaborate that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting paragraph, I think.
Great question for him. Reach out.
Yeah,
I got a check mark right here.
Questions, they can send in our questions.
Yeah.
Get a dialogue on. We got 2 more weeks, guys.
Yeah, somebody should be writing these down.
I think, Audrey, you had your hand up for a while.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I was wondering-
Earlier, you mentioned Eros and, was a god, and also just kind of what was maybe behind a lot of the promiscuity and prostitution. So I guess my question is, did all of this promiscuity mean more to them than just sex? Was it like, oh, there's something romantic going on, even though there's there's multiple sexual partners? Like, did it seem like, was it romantic, or was it just about physical? I mean, that's kind of confusing,
Well,
I guess.
not romantic, I think, but in a sense, spiritual.
Okay.
In the sense that they did think, okay, even sex with a prostitute is an expression of eros. It's the power of eros that's working in me. And that's a power, kind of a cosmic power, that's present here and now in this act.
Is that how the philosophers justify it, or did the common man actually think that while he was doing it?
Yeah, I don't think we can blame this one on the philosophers. There's lots else we can, but I think that was like I said, they had Eros portrayed on their little lampstands in the bedroom, doing such things, and that was sort of an inspiration that was always present, you might say.
How pious.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like, that's pretty similar to modern day promiscuity, I think. People, I don't know, they probably have a similar mentality that they don't think of it that way. But I guess my follow-up question is, for those men that were married but also engaging in prostitution and things like that on the side, did they consider their relationships with their wives to be meaningful in a different way, or in a similar way, or where does Eros come into marriage, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I think it was different. That was my understanding from this. Because, if you're a husband, you want your wife to be a respectable, chaste woman. You wouldn't ask her to do things that you might demand of a prostitute, right? And you're also, with your wife, you're presumably hoping for children, right? So there's a whole different mindset, a whole different valuation that's going on.
Plus, what I read into it is more that the prostitute was a receptacle to alleviate the sexual tension the man had, because they said the life was so terrible for prostitutes that in a few years they looked like a corpse, because they had to constantly perform to make a profit. So it would be boom, 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 boom all the time. So I think that spirituality would have been how wonderful the man was in releasing himself, sort of that type of spirituality.
Mm-hmm. In John Cassius, The Mind of the South, he describes what went on during here in the South, y'all may know this, that the white woman was set on a pedestal, she was to be treated in certain ways, while the male went out and used the slaves to meet his sexual needs.
For property.
The property object.
Yeah.
Well, I hope it wasn't as bad as this, but I'm sure it certainly did occur. Yeah, and
They
there
thought
were
they were
brothels.
Christians all the while they were doing that.
Yeah.
Teaching the slaves Christianity.
To go off what you said, Audrey, I thought it was interesting how you said maybe this view of eros is like, giving this spiritual connection to even prostitution. You said it reminded you of modern ethic. I think, in a sense, there's a greater disaster going on. It's not even a spiritual connection. It's an ethic today, I would say. It's like, there's zero meaning. Like, it's not even, I think you all have, what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Or people are looking for meaning, though, probably within that being.
In prostitution?
Or no, like
In
I'm
the
talking more
promiscuity?
You
promiscuity.
mean down deep, that even if they don't know they're looking for me. But they
Yeah,
can
right.
deny outwardly. This was
Yeah.
a totally meaningless.
I don't even know about that anymore. Like, some of the things that I hear and read about the way people talk about sex, like, for a lot of people, it seems like any sense of connection is just lost. And I hear more and more and see more and more about just the physical and as being purely physical.
Well, sex is recreation.
Yeah, recreational. And I mean, maybe deep down they're looking for a meaning, but I don't even know anymore. I don't even know that we're looking for meaning, which is probably even sadder. Like,
As a priest, so, and the cool thing about being a priest, I don't just hear confessions here, but I also talk to other priests who share impressions about their congregations, and so I feel like I get to hear a lot of interesting stuff. But less interesting really is some of the sexual struggles, because it really is like even prostitution now, it feels more like pornography. It's just kind of like, it's just something you do to kind of like let off some steam, and that's kind of like what it's about. And there's no, at least the way it's presented to me, and the way my brother priests perceive it, it's just like, it's just an act. There's no depth to it. Now, of course, what else is going on inside of the person? Well, there's a lot going on inside of all of us whenever we act out in any sin. But in terms of what's being perceived, I don't think there's a lot of meaning there, at least for most people engaging in prostitution nowadays, at least what I've heard. Maybe there are exceptions to that. But affairs are different. Affairs can be very different.
A lot more than I would have figured through all my years who participate in the Friends with Benefits.
Oh, yeah.
A lot.
Big. Huge.
A lot. And that are open about it.
Yeah.
And so it's just going along with that. It's no longer, it's almost recreational. So when I said it's
But
like
you can
recreational, like a
yeah.
recreational drug, it's no different than that.
I think you could argue that when Father Justin talked about bringing it in, I think what you could argue is that what's happened is that the attitude towards prostitutes and slaves in the ancient Roman world, we just expanded to everybody. Right? It's just, that's what grabbed me when I read it, was just this idea. And I have talks with people who aren't Christian about this. It's sort of like, well, sex is a drive. You don't really expect anybody not to do that, do you? It's natural. It's an urge. It's good without any, sin just never, it's good. I've had conversations with people when you think about children where they would say, well, they're not suggesting we should have sex with children. They would think that was appalling. But the idea was, well, what's so great about innocence? And I hear Rome in my head, right? What you really want to do is hit adulthood and get initiated. My kid's 15, and I'm thinking, in Roman world, he'd be visiting wars by now. And I'm thinking, oh, geez, thank God for Christianity. Just this attitude that it's just a natural thing, it's a good thing, people have pressure, you need to release it, so you do, right? And so it seems to me that we've taken the Roman ethic for slaves and prostitutes and just superimposed it on everybody, which I don't really know is a step up.
Hopko says we're a culture of copulation and computers.
Cogitation and
Copulation.
Cogitators and copulators. I love that line. That's my wife's favorite.
No, we can also see sex as economics. Look how much sexual images
It's marketing.
sales products.
Oh, yeah. That's true.
So it's just pervasive in Michigan.
Yeah. Well, but he, for what it's worth, he uses the word capitalism once in this chapter to refer to the prostitution industry, which was a huge business. And a lot of people made a lot of money. And that would have been,
Still is.
if you think in terms of why did they persecute Christians and why was Christianity so feared?
Half the business.
A lot of it was, it was just a business proposition that I don't want people out there telling people not to come to my brothel.
But you see that already in the Acts of the Apostles with Ephesus and Diana. Paul is hated because he's destroying the cult, which is about the finances of that town. There's an economic connection immediately, even in the New Testament.
So off of what Tina said about the objectification of everyone else as a prostitute in a sense in the modern era, I would say probably even of ourselves sexually. So I'm wondering if you mentioned masturbation or anything like that, and if that would be a shameful act in that ancient culture, whereas today, modern culture, it doesn't. I wonder if that's that flip that Catherine pushed.
There was a reference to masturbation.
Yeah, there was.
Well, there was a brief reference, and what he mainly said was they hardly ever mention it because apparently it wasn't much needed because the prostitutes were so cheap and
slaves.
So
it was just a culture of culturally.
If it was practiced, I doubt they would have considered it shameful. But then again, they might have considered it unnecessary because you've got a brothel right there on the corner. And they said a prostitute was the cost of a loaf of bread. Visit with a prostitute.
I kind of wonder if that's why it's not mentioned in the Bible very much too, because in the Bible they're busy trying to steer people from prostitutes,
Offering your kids to idols.
And that kind of thing. So they don't maybe mention
They should just sort of sift to the bottom of the
because
pile.
in the Bible, maybe like in that time frame, maybe what they were trying to deter people from at that point was more like promiscuity and prostitution. Do you think that's?
Yeah, right. Well, that's the culture they lived in. These things were everywhere.
Well, and consider Christ's words, though. He really does. The law says don't commit adultery, and I say, if you look on a woman, it's like you commit adultery. So he really he takes the law and then really says, well, let's dig deep here. So his gospel is a real shift, even from the Jewish commandments. So as good as they are.
Some things that I saw in Thailand might cast some light on that, on why it's not mentioned and why it maybe wasn't a problem for them. We stayed in a small provincial town in Thailand, and there were some Protestant missionaries there, a very nice young couple, and they were getting very frustrated trying to do their job because they said these people don't realize that they need to be saved because they have no concept that they're sinful. So nothing seems sinful to them. I don't think that was a true perception of the Thais, but that was their perception of it. And just another small anecdote. We had a servant who took care of our baby boy, and she was changing his diaper one day, and she was pleasuring him. And I was horrified, coming from our culture. I was horrified. I said, "What are you doing, Kim?" She said, "Oh, he likes it." She had no idea that there was anything wrong with doing that. It was just something natural that you would do, just like, well, not even recreation. I don't think she was getting it. It was just like you would play with a child or tickle him or pat him on the head. To her, it was just, he likes it, and I do it for him because he likes it, and she had no concept there was anything wrong with it. And so it may be that in that world, that was just something that they had no idea there's anything wrong with it.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking what somebody mentioned, I think Tina mentioned about going back, wondering about what's so great about childhood innocence. I don't know if anybody read the uproar about Lena Dunham's memoir and her treatment of her sister, some things she did with her sister, and I think there was a lot of defense about, well, that was just innocent childhood exploration.
And a doctor.
Well, it wasn't like the problem. The problem was that she was a minor, which kind of gives her a bit of a pass.
Yeah.
But she was still substantially older than her little
Her sister was like
sister
a year old, and
like
she was 12.
3, and she was like
3 and 12.
or something like that.
Yeah, something like that, like her sister. And I mean, she didn't do anything really hard. I mean, it's all horrible, but anyway. But there was just this uproar about, like, well, that's just normal exploration. And I It's like, it's an infant.
Yeah.
There's no exploring.
Well, one of my takeaways from this, and again, I don't want to jump the gun, but just the incredible impact I presume Christianity had on our idea of sex abuse. Like, really, truly. Like, they had no sense of anything being abusive. It was just about your honor.
Right.
So this is a huge, and even in post-Christianity, I mean, if one thing's endured from the Christian legacy among people that don't believe anything, it's that, the abuse is a real problem, that sort of thing. So I'm curious why that one thing stuck and so many other things didn't. But it's interesting. That seems to be totally a Christian legacy. Am I wrong on that?
It's cracking, though. It's cracking.
Gosh.
I spend probably more time in the gutter intellectually than most people who study this stuff. But in the sense of, like, I had that conversation online about, some of you are on Facebook like mad, it's one of my vices, but that all of you are my friends know this to be true. But the article in, after Lena Dunham came out, then the Duggar thing came out, and everybody was kind of losing their minds on the Duggar thing. And so my point, I pulled up this article that was published in Out magazine, which is a gay magazine, where this man, who's a grown man now, and he actually writes children's books, anyway, he writes children's books, but he was the teenage sexual partner of William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg. And he went at 17 to Boulder, Colorado at 17. He had great agency with the intention of seducing these old men. And he successfully did so. And he was their lover for many years. I know that when Ginsberg and Burroughs went into Northern Africa, the boys were probably substantially younger. There is in the literature the understanding, right, that children are sexual beings on some level, right? This pretense that children have no sexuality is not true, right? Yeah. But then I think the question of, well, what's wrong with kids having, and we also know that the age of consent is somewhat arbitrary, and that people don't mature at the same age. And so I do think that the question, obviously there's some that are completely beyond bounds still, which might come out of Christianity, which is like, you don't mess around with 3-year-olds. But I think the issue of how, when you start to hit adolescence, what's wrong with that? I think that question is very alive in certain sections of, in academia even.
Wow.
It's
the question from the introduction that I was left with, because we're getting ready to have rulings handed down from the Supreme Court that will potentially overturn Justinian Code. And he makes a point of saying that Justinian passed made all of these laws and edicts that really was the final point of Christianizing, making it illegal. And now we are at a moment where some of those are going to be repealed. And in some of the arguments, the question was, who are we? One of the justices said, who are we to take this on? Who do we think that we are to just step away?
1,500 years of jurisprudence.
Yeah, from all of this in every culture, why do we think that we are at a point where we know more than anybody else? It was just a question. It's kind of left out there.
That was Kennedy, wasn't it?
I think it was Kennedy.
No conservative.
Lovell, were you going to say something a while ago?
Yeah, I thought that Audrey's question about a man who's married and how he viewed his marriage, what was it, or even in the acts of like men visiting prostitutes and this idea of eros, did it mean something? And she used the word, was there romance? And it got me thinking even how we view the word romance or romantic, or why we even still use it today, like to describe this idea of something deeper in the relationship. And now I'm thinking, wow, what does it really mean? And why are we even using this word as something that we value in our relationships with, amongst each other, or even amongst those who we're married to? Like, is that something that we, as Christians, should even hold, like a word, should even treat it with that value, with that sense? Like I don't even know. I'm just sort of throwing it out there, sort of investigatively for thought. What is that? What does that word hold?
Didn't come out of the Christian tradition, did it? Romance. I thought.
Well,
Lovely.
Michelle, you may know more of this than the rest of us, actually. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it came from in the Middle Ages, the
Right.
French troubadours. There were these sort of wandering poets that sort of idealized married women. Some of this, I've been reading some of this literature, but I'm not in any sense have a full picture of it. But they idealized married women and wrote poetry and songs. That sort of tradition sort of morphed into the courtly love tradition, where you would have, for like the first time, you would have people who were knights or men who were not necessarily attached to someone because they were in a certain polis or grew up in an area, but they had a kind of freedom. The sort of notion of the individual, and they could pledge allegiance to a king or to a woman, and so this idea that we have of romance, I think, or our word, came from this tradition where men would choose women to idealize and to do deeds for, and I don't know, Tina's shaking her head, so she might know about that, but. So I think what you might be saying is romance.
I'm just talking about the root of the word, even just this idea of like the culture within Rome, the Roman culture, and then
I think
how you view these relationships, these sexual relationships, and then now you kind of fast forward to modern day use of the word and how it's kind of the root essence of like, I don't know.
So the romances were written in the language of the Romans in the Middle Ages, which oddly enough wasn't Latin because that was the language of philosophers and theologians, but it was French, Italian, Spanish. Those were considered, like we still call them the Romance languages. So that's where the word comes from. It's just that these courtly love epics were written in the Romance, the Roman tongue.
And then didn't it carry over into monastic literature with as far as holding up the Virgin Mary and the romantic poems that were written to her and the songs that were written about her?
In the West?
Mm-hmm. In the West, yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that.
Especially the French.
I think, if you look at the courtly love literature, it's a kind of idealization of a freedom to choose a particular person to pledge your love to, and pledge your sort of, and do impressive deeds for that person. And even there were these rules of seduction, and there's a whole literature about the kinds of things. You can only be infatuated with one person at a time, right? You can, you're supposed to keep it secret. If it comes out, then, you've sort of violated some of the rules. But generally it was married women.
So it seems to have taken the best of these
except for donkey
pre-Christian, and then the word maybe in its essence kind of developed over time after Christianity kind of permeated the culture there.
The initial courtly love literature was not very Christian. In fact, the church didn't like it too much. But over time, people like Dante and Chaucer did sort of incorporate it into a more Christian kind of practice.
I always thought it was interesting that in Tristan and Isolde that she is supposed to get married to Tristan's uncle, and he's sent to escort her, and she's much younger than he is. Mark is his name. And her mother gives her a bottle of wine and says, "This is magic, and you should share it with Mark, and you will have love forever between each other when you drink this." And there's some confusion on the ship, and Tristan and Isolde drink the wine, and they fall in love. And to me, I think that's sort of a physical description of what happens when you fall in love. That you see in another something beautiful, and you respond to that, and there's this you find your soulmate, or I don't know. But so there was that element in the courtly love literature, trying to define something that people experience in life. And falling in love.
I just thought it was ironic you talk about such sort of devious pagan culture, and this idea that today we use this word romance and romantic and just how it's all
Well, it may be that, a lot of people think that part of what's gone wrong with marriage in our society is that we just expect too much from it, because we want marriage to be a romantic relationship on top of things like having legal children. We want it to be something that gives meaning and purpose to our whole lives, and that's a lot to ask of any human relationship. So, you could argue that, but I thought it was interesting. The romance was already there in the pagan world and was partly trying to find something in sex, I think, more than just the release of a need. So
Pointing somewhere.
I was not ready.
Oh, okay. I guess I pinpointed what I think that this time frame has in common with our era, and that's that I think people are making their sex drive into a god in this day and age. If they don't believe, they definitely, believe like it's something that is a fundamental part of me that defines me that I have to fulfill. And so if they're agnostic or whatever they are, Unitarian or atheist, they're still making their, I think, like in our culture, our popular culture, people are making their sex drive into a god that they're serving, even if they don't have any spiritual beliefs, or even if they're not finding spirituality or transcendence in it, they're obeying it as if it's like kind of the fundamental thing they have to give their lives to. And I see that a lot in the promiscuity for culture. And that's what I think, obviously they were doing when Eros was a god. They're doing the same thing, and they're maybe finding more transcendent meaning in it. But I think that our culture is still obeying the sex drive in the same way, and they're serving it as if it's a god. So I think that's the connection.
And we're back to a pagan culture.
Well,
We told us that garage.
Well, what's odd too, Dave, you said that, maybe one of the problems with marriage is that we expect too much out of it. And you can see that because we choose our partners in our culture, and we expect to be in love with our partners and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, there's also something weird going on side by side, which is in the media with movies and stuff. Marriage is always the dullest. All of the romance and the excitement is in transgressive sexual behavior, right? I mean, it's sort of like the courtly thing in the adulterous part, right? It's the romance is always with the people you're not supposed to be messing with, right? Or out of premarital, extramarital. I mean, I'm just thinking about when was the last time that I saw, it's like Disney, all the parents are dead. I'm trying to think of, there's always somebody dead mommy. It's sort of like, when was the last time you saw like a movie where like marriage was expected to be this?
Well, I think it's anything non-traditional or abnormal now. That's the fun and exciting thing that grabs everybody's attention, and that those people are the heroes and heroines now. If they're odd or they're gay or whatever it is, but something that's normal and everyday is, who cares?
At least the Romans really did hope you'd be happy.
Yeah.
They wanted you to be happy.
It was good for society.
As long as you're authentic, that's all that matters.
Yeah, right. Is it
that's
real?
the thing.
Yeah.
10 surgeries later, I'm not.
There's a Naomi Watts movie that has a story of a married couple that fall in love, and I can't remember the name of it.
Baby Jane?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Which one? Oh yeah, that's a wonderful movie.
Yeah.
Sure.
Would you
I've shown that at the county jail. The Painted Veil. And seriously, Audrey, I've had a man almost break down in tears because he said he never would have believed it's possible to forgive a woman who cheated on you until he saw that movie. And he did. Now he understood what forgiveness is.
Before we go, would you introduce there's a colleague over here?
I'm a student.
Grad student, yes. Michelle Catlin, who is writing a dissertation about this very subject, broadly speaking, love and friendship. You want to say anything else about Did you have a chance to read this?
Yeah, well, I read the first 50 pages,
Mhm.
so I got fair bundle of it, but not a complete chapter.
Glad
Well,
you
we're
joined
going to
us.
come back. And, yeah.
Well,
Maybe we ought to wrap up, and
Yeah.
of course we can always keep talking later.
so next week we're hoping to read up through chapter 2.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, chapter 2 we'll get into the early fathers, like I think Clement of Alexandria in particular.
He's the big
And he will say more about things like free will that are really very important. Even they don't have to do with sex per se, right? But they have to do with how you think of who we are and what we're capable of doing. And that's really the underlying issue here, I think. So I'm glad that that's where we're going next.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you all.
Thank you.
It's not the philosopher's fault.